Silver scraped against porcelain. A brutal, ordinary sound, filling a room suffocating on its own grandeur. She hadn't spoken one word since taking vows. Edmund watched his bride chew dry toast, expecting tears or terror. Instead, he found only vast, terrifying indifference. It ruined his appetite entirely. The dining room at Northam House smelled of cold mutton fat, lemon wax, and the damp, chalky plaster of walls that were 3 centuries old. Edmund, Duke of Northam, sat at the head of the mahogany table. It was long enough to seat 30, but this morning it held only 2. His head pounded, a dull, rhythmic thrum sitting squarely behind his left eye, the lingering tax of a bachelor's farewell that had involved too much cheap brandy and the stale air of a crowded gaming hell. His velvet coat felt too heavy across his shoulders. His cravat was tied too tight. He wanted black coffee and absolute, unquestioning deference. At the far end of the polished wood sat Lydia, his wife of exactly 14 hours. She was not a beauty. He had known that when the contracts were signed. Her family possessed shipping routes in the East. He possessed a title, bleeding money from generations of aristocratic rot. It was a transaction of ink and wax. She had sharp collarbones, pale skin that looked sallow in the gray morning light, and dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. He expected the usual morning after theatrics, the nervous, bird-like flutter of a new bride trying to gauge his mood, perhaps a quiet, resentful weeping into a lace handkerchief. Or, worst of all, the desperate, chirping attempts at conversation meant to fill the awkward void between 2 strangers who had shared a bed. She did none of these things. Lydia reached for the silver butter dish. The lid clanked against the tray. She took a generous scrape of yellow butter and spread it over her toast. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything, really, except the mechanics of her own breakfast. She brought the toast to her mouth and took a bite. The crunch echoed off the high, molded ceiling. Edmund waited. He took a sip of his coffee. It was burnt, leaving a bitter, ashy film on his tongue. He swallowed it down, his eyes fixed on her. She chewed, swallowed, reached for her teacup. "The journey from the chapel," Edmund finally said, his voice gravelly, scraping against his dry throat. "I trust the carriage wasn't too heavily jolted by the cobblestones." It was a concession. A duke did not usually initiate the mundane pleasantries. Lydia paused with her cup halfway to her lips. She didn't look down the length of the table at him. She merely gave a fractional, barely perceptible nod. Then, she took a sip of her tea, placed the cup back on its saucer with a soft clink, and returned to her toast. Not a single word. This. Edmund felt a muscle feather in his jaw. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Each swing of the brass pendulum felt like a hammer striking an anvil. He watched her hands. They weren't the soft, pampered hands of a society darling. Her fingernails were clipped short. There was a faint reddish friction burn on the side of her right index finger from gripping a pen too hard, perhaps. The lace at her cuff was slightly frayed. She was entirely unbothered by his scrutiny. Usually, when Edmund looked at a woman with that level of intense, unsmiling focus, she crumbled. She would flush, look away, babble, or apologize for some imagined slight. Lydia just kept eating her eggs. They were cold by now, the yolks congealing into a rubbery paste, but she ate them with a slow, deliberate efficiency. He found himself growing inexplicably angry. It wasn't a hot, fiery rage. It was a cold, prickly irritation crawling up the back of his neck. He had purchased a quiet, convenient wife. Yes, but this wasn't quiet. This was a barricade. Her silence wasn't born of fear or submission. It was an active, physical dismissal of his presence. She was treating him with the exact same level of regard one might give to a piece of heavily upholstered furniture. He pushed his plate away. The screech of the porcelain bottom against the polished mahogany made a servant by the door flinch. Lydia didn't blink. Edmund wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, threw it onto the table, and stood. His chair groaned against the floorboards. He expected her to stop eating, to look up, to wait for his dismissal. Instead, Lydia finished the last bite of her toast. She touched a napkin to the corners of her mouth. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and turned toward the door. The heavy, stiff silk of her skirts rustled violently against the carpet. She walked with a grounded, heavy step, no gliding, no floating. She opened the heavy oak door herself, ignoring the footman who scrambled forward a second too late. The door clicked shut behind her. Edmund stood alone in the massive room, the smell of burnt coffee and cold fat sitting heavy in his stomach. He had the sudden, absurd urge to throw his teacup at the wall. The rain started just past 2 o'clock. It wasn't a clean, purging rain. It was a miserable, gray London drizzle that turned the soot on the window panes into a greasy slurry. Edmund sat in his study. The air here was dense, with the smell of old leather bindings, stale pipe tobacco, and the metallic tang of ink. He had 3 ledger books open on his desk, charting the abysmal state of the Northam agricultural yields, but the numbers were just black smears. He couldn't get the sound of the knife scraping against the plate out of his head. He rubbed his temples, pushing hard until the skin ached. He needed a distraction. He needed the familiar. Routine dictated that on a dreary Tuesday afternoon, he should send a note to Mayfair. He should spend the evening in a room that smelled of jasmine, drinking expensive claret, and being told he was brilliant, powerful, and desired. He stood up and walked to the tall windows, overlooking the rear gardens. The estate grounds were a muddy, dormant wasteland. The rose bushes were nothing but skeletal cages of thorns, and standing right in the middle of a gravel path that had turned into a muddy trench was Lydia. She wore a dark, heavy wool cloak thrown over her day dress. She had no umbrella. She wasn't wearing overshoes. Edmund leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. What in God's name was she doing? She wasn't strolling. She wasn't gazing wistfully at the gray sky. She was staring at a dead, rotting stump of an oak tree. As he watched, she took a step off the gravel and into the flower bed. The wet, black earth immediately swallowed the bottom 3 inches of her pale blue skirts. The expensive fabric soaked up the mud like a sponge, turning a heavy, dark brown. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She reached out with a bare hand and gripped a piece of peeling bark on the dead tree. She pulled. It resisted, then tore away with what Edmund imagined was a wet, spongy sound. She held the decaying wood in her hand, rubbing her thumb over the pale, worm-eaten fibers. She stood there in the freezing drizzle, her hair plastering to her cheeks, ruining a dress that cost more than a tenant farmer made in a year, completely fascinated by rot. It was utterly bizarre, and yet it was the most real thing Edmund had seen a woman do in a decade. She wasn't performing. There was no audience out there in the rain. She was just existing, anchored heavily in her own physical reality, feeling the texture of dead wood and the cold of the mud. He stepped back from the window, a strange, hollow feeling settling in his chest. He felt like a voyeur who had just stumbled onto a private, sacred ritual. By 6 o'clock, he couldn't stand the suffocating silence of his own house any longer. He ordered his carriage. The ride to Mayfair was damp and jarring. The smell of the wet horsehair squabs inside the carriage made his stomach turn slightly. Camille's townhouse was a furnace. The moment the maid opened the door, a wall of heat hit him, heavily perfumed with burning incense and patchouli. It was designed to feel like an exotic escape, an opium dream, away from the rigid coldness of London society. Tonight, it just felt like a sick room. Camille entered the parlor a moment later. The rustle of her crimson silk dressing gown was calculated, loud enough to announce her, soft enough to be seductive. Her hair was perfectly tousled. Her smile was a practiced, brilliant curve. "Edmund," she breathed. Her voice was a low purr, a sound she had perfected over 3 years of his patronage. She glided across the Turkish rug and placed 2 soft, heavily powdered hands on his lapels. The smell of her jasmine perfume hit him like a physical blow. It was cloying, aggressive, masking the faint scent of sweat underneath. "I didn't think you would come," she said, tilting her head, letting her eyes widen in a display of manufactured vulnerability. "I assumed the new Duchess would have occupied your time." It was a test, a subtle clawing for reassurance. Edmund looked down at her hands. Her nails were buffed to a high shine. Not a single hangnail, not a speck of ink or dirt. "She is settling in," Edmund said. His voice sounded flat, even to his own ears. He stepped back, breaking her hold. Camille's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the porcelain, before she recovered. She moved to the side table, the silk pooling around her feet. "I have the claret you like," she said, her tone a pitch higher, a little faster. She poured the dark wine into a crystal glass. As she handed it to him, she leaned forward, ensuring the lapels of her gown gaped just enough to offer a clear view of her cleavage. Yesterday, it would have worked. Yesterday, he would have pulled her onto the velvet sofa and buried himself in the mindless, comfortable routine of bought affection. Today, he just saw the mechanics of it. He saw the way her eyes darted to his face, checking to see if the cleavage had registered. He saw the stiff tension in her shoulders. He heard the forced, breathy quality of her voice. She was working. She was performing a role, terrified that if she slipped, if she stopped entertaining him for even a second, she would lose her lease, her dresses, her status. He took the glass of wine. The crystal felt thin and fragile. He took a sip. It tasted like copper and old sugar. "Lord Stanton lost heavily at White's last night," Camille said, launching into the gossip she carefully curated to keep him amused. "They say he's mortgaging the estate in Surrey and Lady Jersey." She kept talking, words pouring into the overheated room, filling every corner, desperately trying to drown out the silence. Edmund closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Lydia standing in the mud. He heard the crunch of dry toast, the brutal, honest scrape of the knife. He opened his eyes and set the wineglass down on the marble mantelpiece. The sharp clink times cut through Camille's chatter. She stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open slightly. "I have to go," Edmund said. Camille blinked. The practiced seductress vanished, replaced by a woman staring at a sheer drop. "Go, but you just arrived. Is the fire too high? I can have the maid." "No." Edmund turned toward the door. The air in the room felt unbreathable. It felt like choking on velvet. "Edmund, please." Her voice lost its purr. It was shrill now, panic bleeding through the edges. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Her fingers dug into the heavy wool of his coat. He looked down at her hand. Then he looked at her face. The powder was settling into the fine lines around her eyes. He felt no pity. He felt no anger. He just felt a cold, absolute exhaustion. He was tired of the noise. He was tired of people trying to extract things from him through smiles and sighs. He reached over and gently, but immovably, peeled her fingers off his sleeve. "My man of business will call on you tomorrow," Edmund said. "He will bring a draft. It will be more than sufficient to cover the lease for the year, and your transition." Camille stood frozen, her hand hovering in the air where he had dropped it. "You're dismissing me because of times her? They say she looks like a governess, Edmund. They say she's a mute." Yes," Edmund said, pulling his gloves from his pocket. The leather was cold against his knuckles. "She is." He didn't wait for her to start crying. He turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him, cutting off the heavy scent of jasmine, leaving him in the cold, damp air of the London night. The carriage wheels hissed over the wet cobblestones of Piccadilly, spraying a thin, oily slush against the wooden doors. Inside the cab, Edmund sat in the dark. The damp chill of the leather seats seeped through his trousers, biting into his thighs. He felt entirely hollowed out. The adrenaline of the dismissal had faded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache at the base of his skull. For 3 years, he had paid for an illusion. He had bought laughter, warmth, and the pretense of being a man someone could orbit. Tonight, the illusion had cracked like cheap glass, and he was left holding the jagged edge. Northam House loomed in the rain, a massive block of black stone against a charcoal sky. There were no lights in the upper windows. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum waiting for its next occupant. Edmund let himself in through the side door. The night porter was asleep in his wooden chair, chin resting on his chest, emitting a wet, whistling snore. Edmund didn't wake him. The air in the entry hall was freezing. It smelled of wet wool and the stale, dusty draft that blew down the main chimney. He dropped his damp overcoat on a marble bench. It landed with a heavy, wet slap. He didn't care if it ruined the stone. He wanted a drink. Not the sugary, metallic claret Camille pushed on him, but something harsh. He walked down the long, unlit corridor toward his study. The floorboards creaked under his boots, a complaining, dry sound. As he neared the heavy oak door, he stopped. A thin sliver of orange light bled out from beneath the doorframe. Edmund pushed the door open. The hinges whined. The study was not empty. The fire, which should have been cold ash hours ago, was burning. It was not a polite, crackling parlor fire. It was a roaring, smoking inferno of split logs stacked haphazardly against the brick. Sitting on the rug directly in front of the hearth was Lydia. She was no longer wearing the ruined blue day dress. She wore a heavy linen nightgown, devoid of lace or ribbon, wrapped in a faded woolen shawl. Her hair, previously yanked into that punishingly tight knot, was loose. It hung down her back in a thick, unbrushed mass, catching the firelight. She wasn't staring into the flames with romantic melancholy. She had one of his massive, leather-bound estate ledgers splayed open across her lap. She was tracing the columns of numbers with that same friction-burned finger he had noticed at breakfast. Next to her, sitting directly on the Persian rug, was a half-eaten wedge of hard cheese and a bruised apple. She didn't jump when the door opened. She didn't gasp or scramble to cover her nightclothes. She simply stopped tracing the numbers, closed the heavy ledger with a dull times thud, and turned her head to look at him over her shoulder. The firelight threw harsh shadows across her face, accentuating the sharp angle of her jaw and the hollows of her cheeks. Her eyes caught the light. They were a flat, opaque gray. Edmund stepped into the room. The heat coming off the fireplace was intense, smelling of burning sap and dust. He walked to the liquor cabinet, picked up a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass. He didn't ask if she wanted any. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked over and stood beside her. Looking down, he saw the hem of her nightgown. It was smudged with black ash. "You found the ledgers," he said. His voice was raspy from the cold air outside. Lydia looked from his face down to the heavy book on her lap. She ran a flat palm over the embossed leather cover. Then she reached out, grabbed the bruised apple, and took a loud, wet bite. She chewed, maintaining eye contact. It wasn't defiant. It was observational. She was looking at him the same way she had looked at the rotting oak tree in the garden, assessing the decay. Edmund let out a sharp, breathless sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. He took a swallow of the scotch. It burned all the way down to his stomach, a sharp, clean fire that chased away the lingering stench of jasmine. "They are a fiction," Edmund said, gesturing to the ledger with his glass. "The numbers. My steward is a liar, and I am too exhausted to fire him. The estate has been bleeding out for 20 years. Lydia swallowed her bite of apple. She set the core down on the edge of the hearth. She shifted her weight, placing both hands flat on the floor, and pushed herself up. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room. She didn't gracefully glide to her feet. She hoisted herself up with the heavy, practical effort of a body that was tired. She stood a head shorter than him. Close up, she smelled like wood smoke, raw wool, and the sharp, acidic tang of the apple. No perfume, no powder, just the smell of a human being existing in a cold room. She reached out and took the glass of scotch right out of his hand. Edmund froze. She didn't ask. She just wrapped her fingers around the crystal, brought it to her mouth, and took a drink. She didn't sip it. She threw it back. Instantly, her eyes watered. A harsh, violent cough tore out of her throat. She grimaced, a fierce wrinkling of her nose and baring of her teeth, and shoved the half-empty glass back into his chest. Edmund caught it before it spilled. He stared at her, entirely stunned. Lydia wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of ash across her pale cheek. She turned her back to him, walked over to the desk, and dropped the heavy ledger onto the mahogany surface. The loud times, smack times made the inkwells rattle. She tapped the cover of the book twice with her knuckles, a firm, hard sound. Then she pointed to herself and pointed to the book. "Leave it to me." It wasn't a request. Edmund looked at the book, then at her. The suffocating weight that had been sitting on his chest since the wedding ceremony shifted. The anger he had felt at breakfast, the irritation at her silence, evaporated, replaced by a strange, gripping fascination. She wasn't ignoring him. She was simply cutting out the noise. She recognized that words in this house, in this society, were mostly decorative lies. She didn't want his pleasantries. She didn't want his drunken confessions. She wanted the ledgers. "You want to fix it," he said softly. Lydia gave that same fractional, barely perceptible nod she had given at breakfast. Edmund looked down at the scotch in his hand. He finished it, tasting the faint imprint of the apple on the rim of the glass. "Fine," he said. By Thursday, the silence had become a physical architecture within the house. Before, the quiet of Northam House had been oppressive. It was the silence of a tomb, heavily draped in velvet and smelling of wax. Now, the silence had a pulse. Edmund woke early. The dull headache that usually accompanied his mornings was gone, replaced by a sharp, jittery energy. He dressed himself, ignoring the valet who hovered nervously by the wardrobe, and walked down to the breakfast room. He expected the long, empty table. He expected the cold mutton fat. He opened the heavy oak door. The room was flooded with pale, watery sunlight. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner. Lydia was already there. She wore a dark, heavy gown of forest green wool. Her hair was pulled back again, but not quite as severely. A few dark strands had escaped and lay against her pale neck. She was eating a bowl of oats. Next to her plate, propped open against the silver butter dish, was a thick volume on crop rotation. Edmund pulled out his chair. The wood scraped against the floor. Lydia didn't look up. She turned a page in her book, the rough paper making a dry scratching sound. He sat down. A footman immediately appeared, pouring hot, black coffee into his cup. The steam rose, smelling of roasted chicory and dark earth. It wasn't burnt. Edmund reached for the toast. He grabbed the silver knife. It scraped loudly against the porcelain plate as he scooped up the butter. He looked at Lydia. She was chewing her oats, her eyes scanning the dense text of her book. She didn't ask how he slept. She didn't ask what he planned to do that day. She didn't fill the space with nervous chatter about the weather or the gossip of people she didn't care about. She just sat there, heavy and real, anchored to the chair, existing entirely on her own terms. Edmund took a bite of his toast. The crunch echoed in the room. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel the need to perform. He didn't have to be the charming duke. He didn't have to be the bored cynic. He didn't have to navigate the treacherous waters of someone else's emotional demands. He just had to eat his breakfast. He watched her finger, the one with the friction burn, trace a line of text in the book. He thought of Camille, sitting in her overheated room, desperately spinning words to keep his attention. He thought of the suffocating smell of jasmine. Then he looked at his wife. She smelled vaguely of the harsh soap she used, and the faint, dusty scent of old library books. She reached for her teacup. As she lifted it, her elbow bumped the heavy book on crop rotation. The book slipped, snapping shut, and sliding off the butter dish toward the edge of the table. Edmund's hand shot out. He caught the heavy volume right before it hit the floor, his knuckles brushing against the stiff green wool of her sleeve. Lydia froze. She looked down at his hand, gripping the book. Slowly, she raised her head. Her gray eyes met his. They weren't empty. They were violently, fiercely intelligent. There was a challenge in them, a raw, unpolished wariness. Edmund didn't smile. A smile would have been a lie, a social convention. He just held her gaze, feeling the heavy weight of the book in his hand, feeling the rough texture of the cover against his palm. He carefully placed the book back on the table, propping it open to the exact page she had been reading. Lydia stared at the page for a long moment. Then she reached out, touched the corner of the book to steady it, and gave him a single, deliberate nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of a shared space. Edmund leaned back in his chair. He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip. The bitter, hot liquid burned pleasantly in his chest. The clock ticked. The fire popped in the grate. The silence settled around them, thick, impenetrable, and profoundly comfortable. He had gone to the altar to buy a fortune. He had bought a barricade instead, and as he sat there, listening to the dry rustle of her turning a page, he realized he was finally, safely, hidden behind it. The loudest declarations don't require a single spoken word. Sometimes, the most intense connections are built in the heavy, raw silence between two people who refuse to play society's games. Did Edmund's realization strike a chord with you? If you loved this deep, grounded dive into a different kind of historical romance, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates the power of showing, not telling, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more.